Consider this. In the summer of 1878, in the vast emptiness of Harper County, Kansas, 47 people died in less than a month. The official cause was typhoid fever, an expected plague for the time. But strange things began to unfold that even death couldn't explain. Survivors whispered of glowing blood, shifting skin, and prayers that echoed long after the mouths stopped moving. At the center of this storm were four brothers: Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, and Abel Blackwood. Respected men, God-fearing men, self-sustaining pioneers. But by the end, they were something else, revered by some, feared by most, and ultimately erased from history by the very institutions meant to protect truth. Their transformation was not subtle, it was grotesque, it was divine, and it was permanent. While the fever took mothers and children, the Blackwood brothers seemed untouched, at least at first. They walked among the dying, their prayers louder, their touch stranger, and when the sick began to rise again, healed without reason, the people rejoiced. Then the brothers began to change, and that joy curdled to dread. In the months that followed, their barn glowed through the night, their land grew crops overnight, their voices reached farther than any human throat should allow. And children had dreams, shared dreams, of shapes walking between the wheat. By December, the Blackwoods were dead, or ascended, or consumed. The Kansas State Medical Board sealed every report. The chapel rotted quickly, and no history book speaks their name. But stray mentions remain, scattered across old church registries, half-burned letters, and long-abandoned journal entries. Their story lingers like a curse, passed down in whispers, protected by silence. This is that uncovered truth, the buried madness behind the myth, the cursed Four of Kansas, and the divine horror that tore them from humanity. Welcome to a chapter of dark history the world was never meant to remember. Harper County, Kansas in the late 19th century was not the kind of place that made headlines. It was quiet, rugged, and nearly forgotten, nothing more than a patch of prairie stitched together with fields, fences, and faith. The townspeople were plain folk, farmers, tradesmen, and preachers who lived and died by the rhythm of the land. Cedar Ridge, the small, dust-bitten settlement nestled within Harper's borders, looked much like the rest of rural America at the time: weathered wood buildings, candle-lit homes, and an unforgiving reliance on the mercy of the skies. But beneath its simple surface, there was unease. Softly spoken superstitions still lingered from generations past. Whispers about the land not taking kindly to certain prayers, stories of ghost lights dancing near the riverbank, and unexplainable silences that fell over the fields at night. Most called it nonsense, but even the most devout men, especially them, left room for fear in the corners of their faith. This was a place where science hadn't yet fully arrived, and faith filled every gap it left behind. When the fever came, it didn't knock. It bled through the town like fire through dry wheat. It didn't start with warning signs or strange weather. It started with a girl, Sarah Hartman, 14 years old, fevered one evening, gone by morning. Then her mother, then her brother, then the neighbors. Within days, full households were vacant, doors left open, meals still set on tables. The town initially looked toward familiar remedies, boiled herbs, lay prayers, isolation, but this fever didn't behave like any they'd seen before. It came fast, drowned quicker. Some victims screamed prayers in languages no one recognized, others mumbled incessantly in rhyme. Even after death, there were no medical answers, no natural explanations. The locals grew restless. Some started digging shallow graves even before their families passed, as if their hearts already knew that no help would arrive. By then, a few names were already being spoken in hushed tones. The ones who hadn't fallen ill, the ones who walked unafraid through infected homes, the ones whose skin looked different in the right light. The Blackwood brothers. They hadn't stepped foot in town in over a year, but everyone knew them. Everyone heard their voices on Sunday mornings, their hymns carrying too far for human tones, and it wasn't the plague that people feared most anymore. It was what the Blackwoods had become, and what they might bring next. They arrived in Cedar Ridge in the autumn of 1872, four brothers, weathered but determined, hauling tools, lumber, and an almost aggressive kind of faith. No fanfare, no family, no companions, just themselves, a hand-sewn cross, and a promise to build what they referred to as a sacred place beyond temptation. Locals were skeptical at first, but the Blackwoods earned a begrudging respect. They weren't like the drifting evangelists or broken soldiers that passed through. These men worked hard. They bought 640 acres of pale, infertile land beyond the edge of the town and turned it, slowly and deliberately, into something alive. They built everything with their own hands, their home, their crops, a black ash chapel with no name on the door. The townsfolk called it the Ridge Chapel, but the brothers never used that term. It was his house, nothing more, nothing less. Ezra was the eldest in charge, not by declaration, but by the weight he carried in his words. He didn't speak often, but when he did, people listened and remembered. He had eyes that made you feel like he already knew how you'd die. Caleb, 2 years younger, rarely looked people in the eye at all. He was always scribbling, calculations, shapes, strange symbols with angles too sharp and circles too perfect to be casual. To him, farming was about measurement and ritual precision. If his rows weren't aligned perfectly with the midday sun, he'd tear everything U.P. and start again. Josiah, the third brother, was the mind. Educated, soft-spoken, always with a leather-bound book in hand, quoting passages that even the town's reverend had never heard before. He spoke of ancient rites and Old Testament laws with reverence and mystery, drawing lines between theology and science, like he was mapping some unseeable structure. And then there was Abel. He was the fire, the youngest, the most fervent, the kind whose prayers left his throat raw. He didn't just believe, he felt. Every scripture, every psalm, every silent plea seemed to shake through his entire body. Some described him as haunted. Others said he looked straight through you, like he wasn't seeing your face but your soul. How spoiled it was, how unworthy. Together, they lived apart from the town, isolated, strange, but never causing harm. They worked the land from dawn until dusk, prayed like machines, and refused to attend town gatherings. You'd know them by their clothes, always dark, always clean, despite their constant labor in the fields. More than one neighbor claimed they'd heard all four brothers singing in harmony late into the night. Others claimed their harmonies didn't sound quite human. Still, for years they asked for nothing. It wasn't until the fever came and the Blackwoods remained untouched that the town remembered just how little they really knew about them. Because while others buried their loved ones, the Blackwood farm remained untouched. Their fields stayed golden, their bodies unburdened, their chapel strange in ways no one could name, and the longer the sickness lingered, the more their silence began to feel like an accusation. Some thought them saints, others thought them the plague itself. The first documented death was on July 15, 1878. Sarah Hartman, 14 years old, healthy, full of laughter, gone in less than 24 hours. Her fever was high, her sweat like ice, and in the final hour before she died, she spoke a language her mother couldn't recognize. Not a hallucination, not gibberish, something rhythmic, ancient, like prayer and pain fused together. Then her mother fell ill, then her brother, then their neighbors. Within 2 weeks, Cedar Ridge lost 14 souls, men, women, children, in an inexplicable spiral of fever, delirium, and death. The local pastor described the illness as too fast for nature, too cruel for God. He wasn't wrong. But the truly disturbing part wasn't the speed. It was the details. Some of the afflicted burned with fever but felt no pain, simply smiling and murmuring nonsense until their final breath. Others thrashed violently, tearing at their skin as if something inside needed out. Even the Reverend finally admitted in his journal, found years later tucked inside the wall of the abandoned church, that this is no ordinary judgment. It speaks, it sings, it sees us. As panic spread, the masks of order and faith began to slip. Graves were dug before the bodies were cold, Households were sealed shut, prayers turned frantic instead of faithful, and rumors began to swirl, not just of disease, but of something inhabiting the village. There were moments, instances no one could logically explain. One boy, feverish and near death, suddenly sat upright and began speaking in Latin. Perfect, rapid Latin, naming each of the 4 evangelists, followed by the names of stars not yet discovered. A woman screamed for 9 hours, her voice never weakening, her dead husband's name repeated in alphabetical permutation. When she collapsed, her eyes were gone, not gouged, not burst, just missing, as if never there at all. And yet through it all, through the every scream, each funeral, the suffocating July heat, the Blackwoods remained untouched. No sniffles, no symptoms, no sickness, not among them or their land. It was as if the disease parted around them, or worse, was drawn to everything but them. By the 3rd week, some townspeople had stopped burying their dead, some had stopped praying altogether, but a few, desperate, broken, and clinging to hope, started looking up the hill to the old chapel with no name, where the Blackwoods still knelt daily, murmuring verses no one else could remember, and asking themselves one unspoken question: what if the Blackwoods weren't spared? What if they were chosen? By the 4th week of the outbreak, Cedar Ridge was split between fear and despair. The town's medical remedies had failed. The reverend had fallen silent. The graveyard had swelled past its borders. And then, almost without announcement, the Blackwood brothers came down from the ridge. No explanation, no warning. Just Ezra, Josiah, Caleb, and Abel walking quietly into the center of town one morning as if nothing unusual had happened. Their clothes were clean, their eyes calm, but their presence disturbed everyone like the sudden arrival of a storm on a windless day. People stared, unsure whether to run or kneel. It was Josiah who spoke first. According to journals left behind by a schoolteacher named Miriam Ellis, he stood before the townspeople and said plainly, "We are not untouched. We are being made different, so that others may be made whole." He claimed the sickness was not senseless but sacred, that they had been called by a higher voice, one older than language itself. He said their purpose was to take the burden of the town's pain onto themselves, to absorb it, to carry it, to become vessels for its destruction. No one knew how to respond. Some begged for help, some fled in disgust. But that very night, the first ritual began. It was Abel who initiated it. He walked into the home of a dying man, Willard Cook, 52, unconscious and covered in fever, and placed his hands on the man's chest. He didn't speak, he didn't chant, and yet within minutes the fever broke. Willard began to tremble, then weep. By morning, he was walking, confused but whole. Word spread quickly, and the very next day, Ezra and Josiah performed the same act for a pair of sick sisters, and again, by morning, both were well. But something else began to show too. A tremble in Caleb's hands that didn't stop, a shimmer in the air around Josiah's shoulders, visible from the corner of the eye but lost if you stared directly. Abel began fasting obsessively between rituals, and when he spoke, stories say, birds fell silent. Still, people came. Of course they came. Mothers with dying infants, husbands carrying their sick wives, children too weak to speak. Dozens made the climb to the ridge or waited in the plains below for a chance to be touched, healed, and as each affliction left the bodies of the dying, it seemed to find a new home. In the brothers, their eyes darkened, their movements slowed, and yet, they didn't suffer. They seemed to be changing, not deteriorating, becoming something else. Ezra's voice deepened into something that made listeners tear up involuntarily. Josiah began writing, even in his sleep, entire scrolls of scripture in languages not written in any Bible. Caleb's fingertips developed strange patterns when he touched paper, symbols the local priest described as divine arithmetic. And Abel began glowing at night, a soft, flickering light, like a candle behind skin. The town didn't know whether to thank them or fear them, because soon those rituals stopped looking like healing and started looking like transformation. At first it was subtle, too subtle. things that could be brushed off as exhaustion, side effects, or tricks of the mind. But by August, the brothers were no longer fully recognizable as men. Ezra was the first to shift in a way no one could deny. His skin lost all blemishes, all pores. His blood, observed by Dr. Morrison just once, shimmered gold under an oil lamp and moved as if it responded to sound. When Ezra spoke, people cried, not out of fear or sadness, but something deeper, like their souls had been scraped open. His void and it resonated across the plains, not loud but heavy, like the sound of a bell underwater. It wasn't heard, it was felt. Caleb, who once stayed silent for days, began drawing constantly, on walls, on wood, on the backs of doors, and the dirt beneath crops. But the symbols weren't random. They moved, shifted, rearranged themselves before witnesses, lines that pulsed like heartbeats, circles that breathed. Locals began reporting nausea when standing near his drawings for too long. One man claimed he glimpsed something waiting between the angles. Josiah transformed in thought and voice. He no longer used a singular mouth to speak. His body would tremble slightly, and voices, identical, layered, would emerge from his throat, from the air, and sometimes from behind others. He dictated entire gospels backward, spoke in languages that caused listeners' ears to bleed, quoted lines from books not yet published, and left scorched handprints on every Bible he touched. His skin became paper-like, not fragile, but etched, his flesh scrolling with scripture in motion, like verses were alive and rewriting themselves across his body with every passing day. And Abel became terrifying to behold, even in silence. His skin took on a faint, luminous glow, soft and rhythmic like a heartbeat of light. Animals refused to look at him. Babies did not cry when he held them. They stared, unblinking, as if recognizing something holy, or something final. Wilting plants revived where he walked. But so too did dried bones. One woman claimed he healed her child only for the child to wake weeks later and describe seeing a city under heaven where the stars scream in prayer. The healing didn't stop, but the cost was growing clearer. Whatever the brothers were becoming, it wasn't human anymore, and yet the people came. Desperation dulled mankind's fear. Some began to worship, some began to fast and pray outside the Blackwood's farmhouse, hoping to witness the next miracle. Others withdrew entirely, locking their doors and muttering that this was no longer the work of God. It was heresy draped in grace, and somewhere in their chanting and glowing eyes, Satan was surely smiling. Cedar Ridge stood on a knife's edge. The dead were no longer dying, but something far stranger was living. With each week, the distance between the Blackwood brothers and the people they once lived among grew wider, not through isolation, but transformation. Even when they stood in the center of town, among the healed and the hopeful, they no longer felt present. Their movements grew eerily identical, slow, synchronized, as if responding to an invisible rhythm only they could hear. They no longer blinked. They no longer seemed to breathe. More unsettling than their appearance was the sound. At night, when the wind died and the prairie went silent, the sound of the brothers' prayers rolled across the land, not spoken, sung, a harmony of voices so inhumanly perfect, it made livestock bolt from barns and drove dogs into panicked howls. Locals described hearing it in their dreams, and even further, from inside their dreams. A thick, melodic weaving of scripture, numbers, and language that shouldn't coexist in one breath. People reported sleepwalking into fields. Others awoke with their hands clasped in silent prayer, despite no memory of such devotion. Dr. Samuel Morrison, then Cedar Ridge's only remaining physician, returned to the Blackwood farm with scientific intent. He kept a journal, documenting not just symptoms but phenomena. What he saw there, over the course of 2 visits, he later called a deliberate miracle of violation. On his first visit, he examined Caleb. What he took for tattoos or scarring were actually not skin deep. They were tracking inside the dermis, flowing just beneath the surface, an entire language etched in motion. He wrote, "The symbols behave as intels, Legent ink, turning away from my instruments, hiding." On his second visit, he obtained a blood sample from Ezra. It was not blood. The fluid shimmered like melted gold but moved on its own. It pulsed before the needle even touched skin, and once sealed inside a vial, it began to map itself across the glass in branching tree-like patterns. When placed under candlelight, the fluid rearranged itself, forming eye shapes, then pulses, then a pattern that, days later, Morrison recognized exactly, a constellation in the summer sky, not visible at the time of the drawing. He fled the house with the vial still warm in his coat. His notes, scribbled with a trembling hand, ended with one line: "It knows I've seen it." In town, lines began forming, those who believed and those who trembled. One side gave thanks, ritualized healing onto shrines, shared meals in prayer at the edge of the Blackwood fields. These followers believed the brothers were evolving, blessed with divine properties meant to lead the rest of them into a new kind of faith, a knowing beyond doctrine. The others, skeptics, survivors, pragmatists, started sharpening knives. Boys once healed by the brothers began speaking to things no one could see. A woman touched by Josiah began painting wild, blasphemous visions on her walls, geometries and burning cities, spirals of open mouths, something she called the second heaven. Older townsfolk began posting crude wooden crosses outside their homes, not as symbols of faith, but of defense. The line between miracle and monstrosity had disappeared, and the more people tried to explain what the Blackwoods had become, the more one terrifying truth crept into focus. They weren't healing sickness. They were trading it. And Cedar Ridge had no way of knowing what kind of debt they were truly accruing. If the town of Cedar Ridge still held on to any hope that the Blackwood brothers' miracles was purely divine, that illusion shattered with the children. It began with Sarah Preston. She was 9 years old, previously bedridden from the fever and nearly pronounced dead. Her parents, desperate, had carried her to the chapel under cover of night, leaving her just inside the threshold before fleeing, too afraid to enter themselves. By morning, she stood at their doorstep, alive, eyes bright, skin flawless, barefoot, and humming a melody her family didn't recognize. At first, they wept with joy. But joy turned to dread when she began speaking in slow, deliberate verses far beyond the scope of a child, not just biblical scripture but fragmented theology from apocryphal texts no one had taught her. Her voice would sometimes shift mid-sentence, layering over itself like a doubled echo. Her drawings changed from circles and flowers to complex diagrams filled with triangles, planets, ancient alphabets, some glyphs not associated with any known culture. Then it spread. Other children who had either been near the brothers or healed by them began to act strangely. Some could be found standing silently in the fields for hours, facing north, as if waiting for something the adults couldn't see or hear. Others stopped speaking altogether and simply listened, heads tilted, eyes unblinking. A few began to mimic the brothers' strange harmonies during sleep, lines of whispered sound that made every candle in the house sputter. One boy carved perfect spiral patterns on his bedroom walls using only his fingernails. One girl painted violent epic scenes of burning sky temples across her ceiling in complete darkness, and many, when asked what they were doing, responded with the same quiet line: "They are teaching us." The Reverend, who had once supported the idea that the brothers were chosen by God, finally broke public ranks. In a sermon attended by only 12 people, he quietly warned that, "Our children are being claimed, but not by heaven." Days later, he was found digging shallow pits outside the old chapel, muttering about root structures beneath the wheat. This became the breaking point for many townspeople. The lines weren't just drawn now, they were thick and scarred. Those who clung to the Blackwoods believed the children were being awakened to the next stage of divine understanding, a kind of sacred inheritance. They spoke with pity toward the fearful, interpreting their terror as spiritual blindness. But those who feared them saw the children not as blessed but corrupted, changed into vessels for something they couldn't understand, or worse, couldn't stop. And still, the brothers said nothing. They continued their rituals, continued walking in slow unison, continued emitting sacred, vibrating tones from the chapel that made the air taste metallic. When asked about the children, Josiah simply replied, "They are closer than you. Their minds are open." What he didn't say was to what. Whatever the source of the brothers' powers was, it no longer seemed satisfied with merely healing the dying. Now it was planting seeds, and those seeds were beginning to speak. The tipping point came in late September when the town, fractured, frightened, and teetering on collapse, decided it could no longer exist in silence. Led by Mayor Jonas Merrick, Reverend Alden Finch, Dr. Samuel Morrison, and Thomas Preston, Sarah's increasingly disturbed father, a delegation was formed, 3 believers, 1 broken, 1 skeptic. They walked up to the Blackwood chapel just after sunset, each carrying their own kind of weapon. Merrick with a revolver, the Reverend with a crucifix, Morrison with his satchel of notes, and Preston with nothing but trembling rage and his daughter's ribbon wrapped around his wrist. They found the brothers waiting for them outside the chapel as if they had been expected. The sun was nearly gone, but the brothers seemed illuminated by something soft and internal, casting shadows without a source. None of them blinked. Mayor Merrick spoke, first his voice tight. "Whatever you've become, whatever this is, it has to stop. We need answers. We need you to leave." The brothers didn't reply. It was Josiah who finally stepped forward and offered a phrase that has since been repeated in journals, letters, and the few whispered oral accounts that survived. "There is no leaving what is already within. You fear your evolution because you know it leads to sacrifice." Dr. Morrison demanded to know what had truly happened, medically, physically, biologically. What had changed them? What were they sending into the children? Why was the blood intelligent? Why did the stars outside this valley shine in the wrong places when viewed from their land? Josiah did not explain in science or in scripture. Instead, he offered an experience. They called it a consciousness bridge. He held out his hands and encouraged each of the 4 men to link hands with him and his brothers. "You want knowledge," Abel said for the first time that night, "but knowledge without preparation burns the mind." Only 2 dared. Morrison, hungry for understanding, and Reverend Finch, desperate to believe it was still holy. When they touched, something happened. None of the witnesses could describe it properly. Some said the air convulsed, no wind, but everything moved. Others said they saw colors that don't exist in this world. Finch and Morrison collapsed in moments, both screaming, both bleeding from their ears, both clutching their heads and weeping in silent agony, and yet both recovered. Reverend Finch awoke murmuring prayers in an unknown tongue, lines too precise to be spontaneous. He later carved the words, "We were never first," into the pulpit with his bare fingernails before vanishing into the woods. Dr. Morrison, once the most logical man in town, burned 60 pages of notes, left a sealed letter with instructions never to open it, and was last seen boarding a westbound train. He never returned, but before he left he gave one final statement to the mayor. "They are not spreading illness. They're spreading understanding, a higher form of purpose, but the body and soul must be redesigned to receive it. We are not invited." After the failed confrontation, Cedar Ridge collapsed into quiet dread. The brothers had not attacked. They had not cursed. They had only revealed. The delegation never spoke again. The children continued to change. Those who could afford to leave did. And for the rest, there was only waiting. Because whatever the Blackwoods had become, it was clear. They were no longer asking to be followed. They were leading. And humanity, as it existed, was no longer enough to come with them. Despite all warnings, despite the fear rippling through every barn and back porch in Cedar Ridge, Dr. Morrison's curiosity had not been extinguished, only deepened. In the brief, fevered days before he vanished, he worked obsessively. He performed final blood tests, made diagrams, mapped hallucinations shared by the afflicted children, furious efforts to make sense of what rationality called impossible. What he discovered, though never published, never confessed beyond a single sealed journal, would confirm the townspeople's worst fear. This wasn't an accident. The brothers' transformation wasn't a mutation, a curse, or an infection. It was a ritual, and it had worked. In the blood samples taken from Ezra and Abel, Morrison found structures that should not exist, multicellular formations that demonstrated not only independent movement, but intelligent response. Cells clustered toward warmth, light, even attention, coalescing into symbols that shifted under observation. They weren't behaving like illness. They were organizing, and worse, they had become self-replicating. Morrison wrote that they were not simply evolving. The cells had been informed, as if encoded with a blueprint passed down not genetically but cosmologically, a kind of divine instruction set that acquired vessels willing to sacrifice flesh, thought, and voice in exchange for knowledge beyond matter. Cross-referencing scattered religious texts from Josiah's chapel and scarring now visible on the brother's skin, Morrison reached a harrowing realization. This ritual had been performed before. Not here, but across time. There were scattered references in apocryphal gospels, indigenous oral traditions, and proto-Abrahamic rituals of ascension. Phrases like, "those who wear the light of God in their marrow," or "the four that walk beyond flesh." References to figures who emerged during calamities, not to cure, but to prepare. Prepare humanity for what, the texts didn't say. But patterns began to emerge. There were quiet hints in ancient texts about others who had followed this path, some in the deserts of Syria, others in the remote peaks of the Himalayas, and several drowned by flood myths too identical to be coincidence. Always four, always brothers, always a divine transformation mistaken for plague or prophecy, and always erased, their truth buried by the institutions of the day. The suffering of Cedar Ridge was part of something older, a cycle, a necessary awakening. But with one difference. Morrison's journal ended suddenly. No signature. Just one final page soaked through with water and scorched around the edges. On it, scrawled in shaking ink, "They have completed the passage. The gate was opened. I saw what they became. We are not the ending of this world. We are the beginning of something else." The truth, it seemed, had always been buried, by the Kansas State Medical Board, by the church, by frightened people desperate to reclaim normalcy. But the brothers hadn't died from disease. They had shed what remained of their humanity. Not by force, not by fate, by design. After the revelation, or what little of it reached the townspeople, Cedar Ridge unraveled, not all at once, but like fabric left in the rain, slowly, quietly, pieces tearing away. Following the failed confrontation and Rissen's swift disappearance, the townsfolk no longer came to the chapel. No more offerings were left at the Blackwood's doorstep, no more songs in the wheat fields. The hymns ceased. The harmonics that once rolled over the prairie were replaced by an eerie stillness, heavier than silence, as if even sound feared to return. The brothers no longer appeared among the living. The chapel, once glowing at strange hours, now stood cold. Its windows seemed darker than before, lightless even in the sun. Those who dared approach claimed the structure gave off a static charge, like air before a lightning strike. Inside, the altar was blank, the scripture gone from the walls, an entire sacred language wiped clean. Their home was found abandoned, meals untouched, beds unslept in, tools rusted in mid-use. Their fields, once unnaturally fertile, began to decay with unnatural speed. Crops rotted from the inside out. Livestock refused to graze. Fires wouldn't catch, and compasses spun near their well. Abel was glimpsed once, or something shaped like him, standing alone in the barn, glowing faintly through the cracks in the wood. He didn't move. He didn't speak. The witness described the moment not with fear, but with grief. It wasn't him anymore, she said, but whatever it was, it mourned. One by one, the few remaining faithful packed up and fled in silence. Those who once called them angels now called them echoes, not demonic, not divine, just something else. The Kansas State Medical Board quietly dispatched envoys. By winter, Morrison's files were sealed. Witnesses were warned into silence under threat of institutionalization. No sermons were held to explain the events. No public funeral pronounced. There were only 4 deaths, officially. Ezra was found alone in the chapel, seated upright before the altar, hands joined in gesture unknown to any doctrine. His eyes were missing, not damage, or bloodied. They were simply no longer there. His skin bore a faint, recursive pattern, like the bloom of a star. Caleb lay in his ruined wheat field, arms outstretched, body curled unnaturally, eyes wide open, transfixed on something still overhead. Etched into his chest, a perfect fractal spiral burned into the bone. Josiah was discovered at his desk, quill in hand, a blank scroll rolled before him. Beneath one finger, a word had been carefully pressed. Beholden, written in a language no one could translate. His mouth, some claimed, had been sewn shut. Others said it had vanished entirely. Abel was the last, found in the barn, gently glowing, face upward, lips parted in what might have been speech. He was still warm, his heart still faintly beating, breathing, not at all. None of the bodies decayed. The church buried them in unmarked graves beneath the chapel floor. No prayers were offered. The land once considered chosen ground was fenced off and left to vanish under the creeping prairie. There were no more visitors. The town no longer spoke their names. But silence, like faith, does not mean forgetting. The official record is simple. 4 brothers, men of the cloth, passed away within days of each other during the winter of 1878. Cause of death, complications from prolonged exposure, malnutrition, and psychological deterioration related to the recent outbreak. But the official record lies. Eyewitness accounts, whispered letters, and one final unsigned newspaper clipping, buried in the local archives until the 1930s, reveal something different, something stranger, something that could not be categorized, explained, or endured within the boundaries of medical language, because these were not normal deaths. Ezra's body, as it was found inside the chapel, held no heat, yet the floor beneath him was scorched in the shape of an 8-pointed star. His blood remained liquid for days. His skin responded to touch, stiffening slightly when prayers were spoken aloud. The undertaker tasked with move-in. His body suffered a seizure on the spot and claimed he saw shadows kneeling behind the pews, though the building was empty. Caleb's corpse was buried 3 times. Each time it re-emerged partially unearthed, uncovered by natural elements or, as some believed, willful disturbance. His skin had turned translucent. His eyes reflected starlight even in the day. A surveyor who visited the site reported that Caleb's outstretched arms aligned perfectly with magnetic north, and had not changed position throughout decomposition, if there ever was decomposition. Josiah's death terrified even the doctors. The tissue on his hands bore text, sentences and lines that grew darker if read aloud. Some witnesses reported that his body hummed faintly for hours. Those who read the final word left on his scroll, beholden, experienced migraines, nausea, and temporary loss of language function. His final resting posture, forehead to scroll, hand outstretched, one finger pointing to the northeast horizon, was maintained rigidly, despite rigor mortis setting in. Then there was Abel. He didn't die, not in the conventional sense. When they found him, he was lying in the barn, surrounded by odd scorch marks on the wooden slats, spiral-shaped, calcified. His body emitted low light, no heartbeat, but those who entered said they could feel his presence, as if he were still conscious, hovering just beneath the skin. Reverend Finch's replacement refused to give him last rites, saying only, "That's not a soul I've been trained to guide." The town did what towns do when faced with the inexplicable. It buried the evidence. Chapel sealed, corpses covered, fields burned, the graves, if you could call them that, unmarked. Not for disrespect, but out of deep uncertainty. The people didn't hate the brothers, they didn't defile their memory, they feared what might remain in it, and still some say their presence never lives. There are entries by those brave, or foolish, enough to visit the land decades later. Hikers report seeing faint figures kneeling in the grass. Electronic equipment fails. The chapel, half collapsed, still hums on windless nights, and among those who sleep in the surrounding prairie, dreams come, of strange scripture, of glowing men, of children standing silently in the fields, waiting for a sound only they can hear, waiting for the brothers to speak again. The bodies may have stilled, but the ritual never ended. After 1878, time did what it always does. It moved forward. The maps changed, the people forgot, roads shifted, The name Cedar Ridge slowly disappeared from postal records, replaced by broader counties and new districts. Eventually, it slipped into the folds of forgotten prairie towns, remembered only in local myths and faded cemetery carvings. But the Blackwood land resisted erasure. The chapel remained. The structure, though partially collapsed, never fully decayed as expected. Its charred wood didn't rot. Moss wouldn't grow on its walls, and animals, by all accounts, refused to enter it. A preservation board sent to survey the site in the 1930s described the air inside as wrong, claiming instruments failed, and once functional clocks would stop ticking the moment they crossed the threshold. Local children dared each other to approach it. Most didn't get past the fence. The ones who did came back different, quiet for days, or oddly giddy. One girl spoke in riddles for a week. Another began drawing spirals over and over, unable to stop until her parents burned the drawings in front of her. One boy reportedly disappeared for over 6 hours, reappeared with no memory of where he had gone, and a single line etched into his upper back, as if written by heat: "They wait beneath." Eventually, officials designated the area surrounding the chapel as a wildlife preserve, not to protect the land but to keep people away from it. It was marked as unstable, prone to sinkholes, though none appeared. Trails were diverted. Access became restricted. And still, the reports trickled in. Lights seen through boarded windows, voices heard softly at night, always always in harmony, GPS equipment shorting out, astronomers reporting faint electromagnetic flares they couldn't trace, but which always aligned with the Blackwood property. Medical institutions who once denied the existence of the outbreak fell silent when pressed. Letters sent to the Kansas State Medical Board requesting information were returned unopened, stamped, record sealed, not for public disclosure. What files existed were believed to have been destroyed or relocated deep into federal archives. As folklore grew into conspiracy, a strange pattern emerged. Similar stories began to surface in other parts of the country and the world. Remote areas, isolated outbreaks, always for individuals, always a sickness, always followed by healing that twisted into something else. Then, silence, vanishing, erasure. People began to ask, were the Blackwoods a beginning, or were they part of something much older, now repeated? A quiet network of researchers, the kind that read apocrypha for fun and searched declassified documents for meaning, believe the brothers tapped into an ancestral ritual far beyond theology. Something tied to primordial knowledge. A language embedded not in words but in form, in geometry, in rhythm. And it's never been about belief, it's about structure. A structure too complex for human consciousness. One that reshapes whatever dares to contain it. That's the legacy the Blackwoods left behind. Not their chapel, not their farm, not their graves or their miracles, but the idea that transformation is real, not spiritual, not metaphorical, but biological, physical, complete. Something is waiting, and has always been waiting. Somewhere between science and faith, between sickness and salvation, are those who went too far. Or perhaps just far enough. Truth, like disease, spreads quietly, but it never disappears. For over a century, the story of the Blackwood brothers has been sealed, forgotten, whispered about only by the kind of people no one listens to. The journals were hidden, the bodies were buried, the land was renamed, reclaimed, and eventually abandoned. But some stories refuse to die, not because people hold on to them, but because something in the story holds on to us. What began as an unexplained sickness became something far stranger, far more terrifying, a transformation so complete that even death itself had to bend around it. These 4 men, Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, and Abel, did not heal to save. They healed to evolve, and in doing so they crossed the boundary between man and myth, faith and form, into something that science could not classify and religion could no longer bless. They were never the miracle. They were the mechanism, and Cedar Ridge was just the vessel. In the end, the Blackwood brothers achieved what few ever dare to, communion with the divine, not by metaphor or prayer, but by surrendering their very biology. They gave themselves over completely to a voice or a song or a structure echoing through time, and for that they were buried, by mud, by memory, by institutions who understood that truth this large, this impossible, could break the world open. But look closely, at the fields left to rot, at the chapel that won't fall, at the children who still whisper symbols in their sleep generations later. The Blackwoods are not gone, not entirely. They changed. And change, real change, doesn't ever stop. Maybe they were a warning. Maybe they were a gift. Or maybe, and this is the thought that lingers the longest, they were simply the first. And others, even now, are preparing. The truth was never erased. It was sealed. And now you've seen it. Welcome to the cursed history of the Blackwood brothers, a macabre truth buried by science, but exhumed by time. If this story unsettled you, ask yourself, was it the horror that disturbed you, or the possibility that it might be true? Subscribe for more forbidden histories, unsealed secrets, and the unspeakable truths lurking just beneath the veil. This has been the Cursed Four of Kansas, and some things should never be remembered, but must never be forgotten.